As some of you might know, I once was a big fan of the F1 franchise by Codemasters. In fact, I still to this date own every edition of their F1 games, and I have been spending hundreds of hours in these games. And admittedly, today still their games are the best for recreating the most authentic, modern F1 experience, as they have all the rules in place, they have all the licensed cars and tracks of the current season, and things like a career mode or My Team. However, as you can tell if you followed my channel, Automobilista 2, with its sheer amount of F1 content through all the eras and many historic period correct tracks, which you'll find me using a lot if you want to take a look around on my channel, and the very disappointing F1 22, of course, they have taken me away from the Codemasters franchise. With F1 23, I gave Cody's another chance, and this game somewhat inspired me to do this video. In today's video I'll rank the Codemasters F1 games from worst to best. Now, please be aware, this is my own opinion, you're free to disagree with me, and feel invited to discuss and give your opinion in the comments below, as I'm really interested in what you think and how you feel about some of these games. Oh, and another short disclaimer, I won't include F1 2009 as this was only released for Wii and PlayStation Portable. I never played it, and because of its platform it's hardly comparable to all the games from 2010 to 2023. And then there also is F1 Race Stars, Codemasters Mario Kart clone, that in my opinion is one of the best Mario Kart clones out there, but it can hardly be compared to all of the other games in here. So, now without further ado, let's start with the first one, and I think to the surprise of no one that has played all of the F1 games, this is F1 2014. This game was flawed from the very beginning. It released only for the PS3 and Xbox 360 console generation, despite the newer generation of PS4 and Xbox One already being on the market. Not only that, but it lacked popular content compared to its predecessor, namely the historic content only included in 2013 for the first time and dropped already for this game. Furthermore, everything looked and felt like a very cheap reskin. The sound was awful, even for those generation of cars, and the handling felt terrible. To be fair, most of the drivers also complained about how 2014 cars drove in real life compared to the previous generation, so maybe that wasn't even the most unrealistic thing. But yeah, now I think it would have been better for Cody's to just leave 2014 out, as they had a lot on their hands with the console generation change, and well, the result obviously was this game. Next on our list is its successor, F1 2015. For many, 2015 was also very terrible, for many understandable reasons. I want to take a more differentiated approach to it, however. In its essence, F1 2015 was practically like a very first game. New engine, new console generation, and it still is the basis for the modern F1 games. Now, if it wasn't for F1 2010 to 2014, I think F1 2015 would have been much better received. It sure was very buggy at the beginning though. But apart from that, it was solid, especially considering they had to start a lot from scratch. As a result, lots of content went missing. There was no career mode, for example, the most popular game mode from 2010 to 2014. 2015 had nothing but simple multiplayer, solo races, and championship season as one of the original 2015 drivers. And because they realized that that was a bit lackluster, they added the option Pro Season in the menu, which essentially is the same as championship season, but with all assists turned off and 100% races. At least it also had the entire 2014 season, so as the only game so far, at least covered 2 seasons. Funnily enough, I personally think F1 2015 was the better 2014 game, which makes the release of 2014 even more redundant. The lack of content though is what puts 2015 so low. It was just empty, stripped down to its very basics, but at least the foundation was solid after most of the bugs were fixed. So now, here we are already with F1 22, and that tells you a lot. The situation for 2014 and 2015 was an unfortunate one. F122 was bad without the need of being so. The only reason I can think of is the negative EA effect, and no, I wasn't even one of those people who has written off the first game developed completely under EA ownership beforehand. I was more like looking forward to it, as Codemasters finally had more resources available to them. Tragically, in some way, I found this to be worse than 2015 even. I feel like between 2015 and 2020, always something meaningful and new was added that improved the game. Outside of new tracks, and cars of course. These are to be expected in an official F1 release. F122's additions, however, supercars, furniture and casual clothing, that is supposed to be some joke, right? Oh, and VR was added that not many users benefit from, but even for those that do, it isn't really well optimized and takes loads of time to set up. Just hopping into it was super blurry and motion sickness inducing, even for me that has never ever suffered from it after hours of playing different games in VR, and even after reading through many setup guides, taking suggestions from others and trying out stuff myself, the experience was never really as satisfying as it is in Automobilista 2, for example. In fact, it never came even close to me. I'd love to show you what I mean, but unfortunately I can't, since on a regular monitor pictures will turn out fine. More so, my biggest gripes when playing this game was absolutely inconsistent car behavior that I never experienced before. I mean, I don't ramble on about what I feel is realistic. I have never driven an F1 car, but I at least want a believable and consistent driving experience to work with. If I take the same corner in F122 in exactly the same way 10 times, it might happen that 3 out of those 10 times I spin for some reason while I'm totally fine the other 7 times. I never had that in any F1 game. Plus, and that was especially bad at the beginning of its life cycle, the AI were so overpowered on the throttle out of slow corners. I remember starting my team career at the race in Bahrain. I had no chance against the AI. Out of all the slow corners, they were able to go full throttle while I only had to look at my paddle to cause some wheel spin. This of course is my experience racing without traction control. If you do race with it, you might have never experienced that. Then the second round in Jeddah, just after Bahrain, I had no problem whatsoever, completely overperforming because there weren't so many slow corners, but rather fast and flowing ones. And that was so off-putting that I never really enjoyed my time in F122. But enough rambling over that game, let's move on to more pleasant experiences. On to F1 2011, and from here on, there is no game I really disliked, opposite to the 3 we already talked about. F1 2011 for me always felt a bit off between 2010 and 2012. I'm no one that rambles on about what I feel is realistic, as I said, but for me a solid F1 gaming experience is what matters. But F1 2011 was a little too arcadey even for me. The cars were very easy to drive, even on harder settings, and the game looked a little oversaturated. It was the complete opposite to the kind of rather dark and depressing looking F1 2010. Though that of course is rather a secondary thing, I don't mind that too much. It still was fun, like all of the upcoming games, just a little forgettable and not too challenging to really work your way into it. Very fun for just a quick race in between though. Well, here it is already, F1 23. Now, to put it positively, it is a definite improvement over its predecessor. Negatively, it still is nowhere near the top for me. F1 23 is an improvement on the weird handling and feeling of the cars in F1 22. But in my opinion, you can't really put it higher just because it fixed something that wasn't broken before. New features are the red flags, and that is very cool as it's a much more in-depth implementation compared to the pre-2015 games when it was there as well. That's because when it comes, it definitely changes things up. But that's the thing. If it comes. Red flags are not really that much of a big feature if you're looking for an authentic experience. It's not like they happen all that often, at least in races, where they have the biggest impact. Especially compared to safety cars or VSCs, that of course is if you're not racing in Melbourne. Still a nice addition. However, they were broken in the first weeks after release as well, and don't forget, they were the most hyped up feature of the new game in the F1 game community, which is not really a big feature in the first place in my opinion, and then it didn't even work properly, so that can't be good, right? Story mode then made a comeback as well, but then again, it's a thing you play once and then forget it. I always feel like lots of resources that could have been used better went into a feature that rather is a gimmick or something for very, very casual players, only buying the game for that short story mode sequence and then hardly touch it again. I get what they wanted to do, but it isn't even executed well, and honestly, I think you can't do a good story mode in a game like F1 23. It worked well for a game like Tokka Race Driver 2, with lots of different series in the game, but here, I don't know, man. It'd be cool to have a similarly interesting, fun story mode, but I just don't see it work for F1 games, and furthermore, the story is worse than 2021. It feels like they were not entirely sure what they were going for, or were asked for simply too much to cover. The writing feels very half-hearted and the characters are confusing at best. Who are we rooting for? Why is no one likable except Devon Butler, who you love to hate because he is such a prick? I am already back mainly playing AMS2, racing modern F1 cars on a multitude of tracks that are currently not in the calendar, or firing old F1 cars up to race on the old Nordschleife, a classic Spa, or even just the old Hockenheimring, Jerez or Estoril to have something of the more ordinary stuff. That still is something that these modern games don't offer at all, which in terms of an official F1 game would add a lot more value than a story mode, F1 Live or the really stupid supercars could ever do. Oh, and I totally forgot the new F1 World, which feels like a mobile game in higher resolution, fully licensed and on the big screen. If you played it, you hopefully know what I mean. It feels just like an excuse to push microtransactions forward. I found it really hard to rank this one, as it's not necessarily bad, but I asked myself, where would I rank it considering how much I enjoyed it compared to the other entries? This, plus the lack of new content, at least in career mode and my team, which for me are the most important modes with the best longevity, this indicates to me the direction these games tend to be going with F1 World. The result is this subjective spot, still very low on the list. From here on, I'd even consider all of the upcoming games as good, and I had lots of fun with it. So no disrespect for F1 2010 that I know many people still have a very good opinion on, and rightly so. For the start of a new franchise, I'd say it was a very good getaway. It was pretty challenging to drive though, very satisfying if you got it right. I also have very positive feelings, as this was the first time I was able to experience a full F1 season in a game since playing F1 06 on my old PS2. Most enjoyable, and what I still miss today, is that F1 paddock feeling. The menu was set in the F1 paddock and you really had a feeling of traveling around the world when the backdrop where your motorhome and stuff was standing changed depending on where you were in your career mode. Now, from a user experience perspective, I totally get why they went back to conventional menus and interfaces in 2012, especially as 12-year-old me was super confused when first playing, but it was creative and had a very nice charm to it. However, I briefly mentioned it before, man, that game looks depressing with that odd filter. I'd rather have that overly bright F1 2011 than this one graphically. Now to a game I've spent a lot of time in. F1 2012 was very solid in my opinion. It built from F1 2010 and removed the oddities of F1 2011 and added back the more challenging aspect for those that wanted it. Another very good simcade in this series in my opinion. Next to career mode, there were shorter championship seasons with an interesting rival format rather than the career mode that took lots of time, and what I also enjoyed was that they made use of having 6 world champions on the grid in that awesome season where you faced each one of them in a unique scenario, kind of playing on your opponent's strengths. Those modes, of course, did not have the longevity that career mode had, but seeing that that's what they actually intended, it did a pretty good job doing so. Sadly, the old menu style was gone and changed to a more traditional, polished one. Now a bit of a jump in time. F1 2016 is next, and that one brought back lots of beloved features from pre-2015 games, most importantly the career mode, and it was better than it ever was before. Controllable R&D, though very basic compared to the more modern games, and even a little bit of that paddock feel from 2010 when sitting on your laptop in the mobile team lounge. But not only improved old features were brought back, the practice sessions were finally and for the first time meaningful. While nowadays no one would do these track acclimatization, tire wear, fuel usage tasks in practice, they were a big thing, at least for me there. Before, I was always skipping through practice and went straight into qualifying, but with those practice programs you actually could kind of feel more like an F1 driver, as successfully doing them granted you resource points to further develop your car. Another brand new feature that was great was that you only had a restricted number of engine components, just like in real life. Depending on how reliable your car was, these did wear out faster, and you'd receive grid drops when you had to exceed these limits, just like it was in reality, and that did actually happen and was not just some gimmick. Not investing in reliability saw you definitely get a lot of grid drops during the later stages of the season. Oh, and don't forget manual starts. This was the first time they were all a feature. Most of these are such a common thing nowadays, and they still here. 2016 definitely was the foundation of the very strong games that should follow. After 2 disappointing years in 2014 and 2015, the F1 games were finally back on the right track, and that was a great relief. The driving felt solid and continued to do so for the next years, at least for me, with one upcoming exception. You might start to see a pattern develop here, and I previously mentioned that. Between 2015 and 2020 you saw consistent improvements to the games, always making them better and better. So only logically, 2017 is the next game to follow. Not only was the career mode further improved by, for example, a more in-depth R&D tree, classic F1 cars first seen in 2013 were back in a different way. We'll talk about 2013 later on, don't worry. At first I thought they were back in a better way, as this time they were somewhat worked into the career mode, as you were approached by some rich bloke collecting F1 cars who wanted you to drive these cars for some show runs during the season. Of course, you could also just race them solo or in multiplayer, but the issue was that there was 2 classes, one including cars from 1988 to 1998 and one from 2002 to 2010. And neither had authentic driver names, but some randoms driving these cars. And racing a McLaren MP4-4 against an MP4-13 isn't really a fair fight and doesn't make any sense at all. But it's a cool addition just for doing a couple of laps in those cars though. Plus, some rivalries even made a bit of sense if you ignored the rest of the grid. For example, racing the MP4-6 against the Williams FW14 or the Ferrari F2002 against the McLaren MP4-23, for example. Further improvements here and there, for example the in-depth of R&D for career, put this one ahead of its predecessor. And the games continued to improve. 2018 was another step forward. It expanded further on what was there already, with, for example, adding a 3rd classic car class, making use of some of the 70s and early 80s legends, racing the 1978 Lotus, the 79 Ferrari and the 82 McLaren together worked really well, and so did the 1972 Lotus versus Hunt's 1976 McLaren and Lauda's 1976 Ferrari. For career mode, longevity value was added by making it possible for you to have rule changes that might render some of your car improvements meaningless unless you diverted more resource points into saving these upgrades. That additionally changed the pecking order of the other teams as well. Also new in terms of the authentic driving experience, ERS management. While driving, you are now finally able to change the battery output of your hybrid engine system depending on whether you wanted to put in a qualifying lap, attack a driver, or conserve energy when you finally made it past someone and now needed to recharge the battery. Now to divert a bit from the pattern we've seen, as there are now 2 games in between. The first one is F1 2013. That was by far the best game of what you could call the old Codemasters generation of games from 2010 to 2014. It had all of the good things from the previous games and the best implementation of historic F1 content yet. That is, including all of the modern F1 games that had them in. They had actual driver names, so if you'd enter a race with them, you actually had the likes of both Schumachers, Irvine or Häkkinen. They were still kinda separated in an 80s and a 90s class, but they actually made the effort to include some of the cars that actually race against each other, like the 1988 Ferrari, Williams and Lotus, or a Ferrari and Williams each for 1992, 96 and 99. The only small minus point, not all cars had their actual drivers, because that would have meant you might have 2 Michael Schumachers on the grid. So they made use of what they called legacy drivers that drove at least for that team at some point. And there were also, for the only time, classic tracks that were fitting to these cars. Classic versions of Brands Hatch, Jerez, Estoril and Imola, on which you were also allowed to race the modern cars on. And that is something I think every other F1 game on this list is lacking. Track variety outside the current calendar. No matter what the rest of the game looks like, it gets repetitive if you're only being allowed to race the same tracks over and over again over 10 seasons. Give us more variety. It doesn't even have to be classic cars or tracks. Modern versions of Grade 1 circuits where F1 could really potentially race at would be enough. A Hockenheimring, Sepang, Nürburgring that can be used in career mode or whatever to spice things up would add so much longevity and replay value to career mode and my team. Now, still diverting from our established pattern, here is F1 2021. The positives first, this is probably the F1 game I spent most time in, and that has 2 reasons. A, I finished university during the time it came out and had a lot of time on my hands after handing in my paper before starting working, and B, in some ways it had what I just mentioned at the end when talking F1 2013. After release, 3 tracks were added one by one that weren't included in the original 2021 schedule and or Codemasters didn't get done in time. These were Portimao, Imola and Jeddah. So when these tracks were released each, my interest in the game peaked again, especially for Portimao that literally was released a day after handing my university paper in. And the best part, you had the tracks of the original 2021 non-COVID affected calendar in there too, like Shanghai, Suzuka, Melbourne and so on. Finally, after the release of Portimao, there always was one more track available than slots in a full season, and at the beginning of each season, after the first one, you were able to kinda choose which one you wanted to leave out, so you had a bit of variety in the calendar, even if it was just one track each time. That was the only time I did more than 2 seasons in career on my team, simply by that very, very small option. One more positive thing was co-op career was back. I used it a bit and actually found it pretty cool, but somehow me and my friends never actually finished a single season. Now, to the negatives though. Apart from that, not much changed or improved from 2020. There was the highly advertised Breaking Point story mode that I enjoyed somewhat, but which didn't really have replay value and you didn't spend much time in it. I feel like many resources went into this that maybe would have been spent better elsewhere. I get what they tried to do, kind of riding on the Drive to Survive hype, but I've talked about F1 games and story modes before, so let's don't delve into this another time. Furthermore, classic cars were axed. A bit of a shame really. There were more and more cars added over the last years, and maybe at one point they could have even created more meaningful, comparable classes that actually would have made sense if they went on with it, but whatever, not the most tragic loss, seeing as they were not used too much, most likely because the way they were implemented didn't make too much sense. And then there is one more negative. For the first time I had kind of big complaints about realism. You see cars on television attack curbs, riding on them, using them everywhere, and in this game sometimes you spun while just looking at them. The F1 games always kind of had that sort of issue, but in F1 2021 it was really bad, I feel. But still, it was only a slight step backwards, not nearly as bad as F1 22 was. Well, but now you can probably tell on how this ranking will continue if you listened to what I said before, right? Now, back on track, and here we are with F1 2019. This game was another improvement on its predecessor. New this time, the addition of Formula 2, fully licensed with 2018 and later also 2019 season drivers and, well, obviously tracks, seeing as they're an F1 support series. That added a new layer to career, as you were able to start in F2 already with the 2018 season and then get promoted into F1. That was very cool in my opinion. More classic cars, and what was very cool this time, the 2010 McLaren and Ferrari, adding to the 2010 Red Bull and Braun GP from 2009, which meant 4 different cars from roughly the same rule set, meaning some good competition there. In fact, one of my oldest videos on this channel is me recreating the 2010 season finale and commentating over it. In this case, still in German though, so feel free to check this out. Kind of the first time of me doing what I now do with Automobilista 2, creating these classic F1 seasons. And of course, a very important and great thing, driver transfers in career mode were a new first here as well, only adding to the replay value of career. And now, in my opinion, the best Codemasters F1 game to date is 2020. And it easily claims that, as it kept all the positives from 2019, adding a very cool and long requested feature, the My Team career mode. I mean, if you play the F1 games, you very well know this mode, as it's still there and one of the most popular ones, but let me just briefly go over it. You were able to create your own team as 11th entry on the roster, manage sponsors and finances to improve your facilities, also new that year and also used in normal career mode. These facilities were needed to further unlock R&D options, because some upgrades were only possible if your facilities had reached a certain level. Of course, there always still is room for improvement, like a proper custom livery creator, but it was an awesome start. Also added were more classic cars. This time, some of the greatest Schumacher cars, especially cool were the Jordan 191, in which he first raced in F1, though only for one race, and his 2 title-winning Benettons I've rarely, if not ever, seen as official content anywhere. Very cool. The racing was also good fun. Podium Pass was new, and I know many didn't like it, but I found it actually pretty good, as it motivated me to play more, to unlock rare liveries, helmets or outfits for multiplayer and my team. Seeing as only cosmetics were in that pass, and actually useful cosmetics for a racing game, yes, I'm looking at you, furniture and clothing items from F1 22, it made it a good addition for me. Added the fact that you were able to unlock enough premium currency and more in one premium season to buy the next one without spending extra money made it even more welcome. Let's conclude this video by giving an outlook on what I think would put the Codemasters games back on the right track after leaving the one they carved so well between 2015 and 2020. First, and I think most importantly, add more tracks and make them usable in career modes and not just for single races. Just 3 would be more than sufficient for the start. I know licensing might be not that easy, but come on. We still have China, despite not having actually raced there since 2019, Portimao, that was only ever used twice as a COVID stand-in, and Paul Ricard, that isn't on the calendar anymore. For starters, let us use them, and maybe as in 2021, add more tracks, maybe even as paid DLC over the year to boost player numbers later in the game cycle. Hockenheim, the Nürburgring, Sepang, Istanbul, Jerez, Estoril, but in India, Yeongam, or however it is pronounced in South Korea, just to name a few that were already in the game previously. I know licensing can be an issue, but come on, with all that EA money you sure can't afford it. I get there is an urge to put in a story mode to lure in newer players from Drive to Survive, but maybe first get enough content to justify a story mode. More junior formulas, but at the very least Formula 3, seeing they already are an F1 support series, racing on the same tracks. Have us work our way up, do it properly and make our decisions matter, if you have to do it. Put classic cars back in, either like in 2013 with classes with more similar cars era-wise and proper drivers on tracks, or work it into career or story mode but properly and not as half-hearted as it was done previously. There is more than enough events around the world where these cars are being used, like for example the Hockenheim Historic I went to earlier this year, which is a very cool event, so if you ever have something similar near where you live, try to go there and see those old cars in action. Back to the topic though, and back to an absolute utopia, well that's probably never gonna happen. I know it'll get impossible at some point to add something new to a sports game franchise like this with a yearly release cycle, but why not have it as a live service? They're only a slight evolution of their predecessor. You still find lots of elements in today's game that were introduced in 2015. Have us pay for a new season DLC, but the more content a game like this would have, the better it could be. You could be able to choose in which season you'd like to start your career mode, and actually have not only the drivers and performances around you, but also the other cars, teams, grids, and the looks change from season to season, maybe, possibly, also go backwards and give us full classic seasons, but that is just me dreaming. Right now, unfortunately, it looks like we're really going down the EA road with development focus on cosmetics, in-game shops and weird gimmicks like supercars and story mode. F1 Ultimate Team surely will be on the way as well, I fear, after the introduction of F1 World, and if this year's game is anything to go by, we probably know where the development focus is going. I sure hope I am wrong though. Anyway, that's been my 2 cents as conclusion to this ranking. Share your opinion in the comments, leave a like if you enjoyed this video, and if you're interested in either racing with classic cars or me creating an alternate F1 timeline from the 2022 season onwards, driving for my own team in a 24-car F1 grid in Automobilista 2, feel free to check out those other videos and subscribe to this channel to not miss anything. Until the next time, goodbye.